When it comes to making decisions in a role-playing game, it can be difficult to find something that has more impact on gameplay than the character class. Oftentimes this single choice determines almost every aspect of a player's ability, from the weapons and skills they have access to in combat, to the dialogue and decisions that they can make in the world. And when a single choice has that much influence over gameplay, it can be scary for a player to make that choice. It's entirely possible, after all, that the player selects a class whose features are just wrong for them, and not the gameplay experience that they're looking for. So the priority for game designers becomes communication, packaging classes together and presenting them in a way that shows the player what experience they can expect when they make that selection. Classes like Mage, Thief, and Warrior all have an element of instant recognition to them, and that package pairs with a player's sheer amount of experience, from former games they've played to the image of classes other forms of media have instilled in them. Most players can look at a class selection screen like this and without thinking, identify what certain classes probably represent. They might have played a tabletop RPG like Dungeons & Dragons and know what fighters are like. They might have read The Lord of the Rings and have some semblance of wizard abilities through Gandalf. Or they might have watched Conan the Barbarian and can imagine what a barbarian would play like. But it's that recognition, that past, that history, that makes packaging new or similar things to a player especially difficult. Pause the video here and look at this class selection screen again. But as you look them over this time, ask yourself, do you recognize what every class represents in this image? If you can identify them all, that's great. What it probably means is the things you've come across in your life, the knowledge you've amassed, and the media you've consumed has helped create that pre-existing understanding for you. Or you've played Pillars of Eternity a lot, which is understandable because it's a great game. And anyone who's been on the channel for a while knows that it's a game I've used often to introduce new players to Infinity Engine style games, and more broadly RPGs in general, that were hesitant to try other similar games given the older graphics, lack of accessibility, or whatever else caused them to refrain. And when I first played Pillars of Eternity several years ago, I had been playing RPGs for over a decade. I had watched and read Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and any other fantasy media I came into contact with. But even with a lot of these instant recognitions, there was two that even I couldn't identify by name, the Chanter and Cypher classes. And so for me personally, that struck a feeling of interest. I read the descriptions, I had cheated a little and taken a look at their abilities, and ultimately came to the decision that they weren't what I was looking for, and I selected a Paladin, which was a pretty standard decision for me. But as I've gotten more involved in suggesting the game to newer players that were looking to get into role-playing games, so too have I gotten more involved in asking questions about their experience. And the more I have asked questions, the more I have learned that my reaction to seeing classes I didn't recognize, looking into them, wasn't a very common approach among these newer players. In fact, as I started watching people create their characters, I've noticed a lot of them actually skip classes over, like Chanter, Cypher, and make another selection. When I would ask why, I would get very similar answers, along the lines of, I didn't know what that class was, or I already saw one I recognized that I really want to play. And at first I didn't understand. I thought maybe it was a case of wanting to be something they've seen before, which is very common in role-playing games. We've all seen a character like Aragorn the Ranger and wanted to play that role or class similarly. But then I started asking them the question I asked all of you. Which of those 11 classes did they recognize coming in? Sometimes it was quite high. They would get 8, 9, or 10 different classes. One of them even drew a connection between Chanters and Bards without even reading the class, something I hadn't even done. But more often than not, it was less than 8, and the more classes they didn't know, the more hesitant they were to select those classes. And when I asked why, the answer was almost always out of fear that they wouldn't understand how to play the game, correlating their pre-understanding of a class to their chance of succeeding, or even scarier from the design perspective of having fun as that class. And as I've gotten increasingly into Dungeons & Dragons over the last year as a dungeon master, I've introduced many first-time players to that game as well and noticed similar patterns. Sometimes the player has no interest in hearing about things they've never heard of before, and asks me to skip classes like Artificer or Druid. Sometimes they might get confused at the differences between a priest and a paladin, or a sorcerer and a wizard, and just move on to the next class description. D&D Beyond does these excellent class distribution updates every so often that keep track of what classes players are playing in their game. And you can see that these massive gaps between some of the classes. That's how they know to address certain issues. But so far, the solution to this fear, or hesitance we'll call it, seems to be a natural one. In my experience, eventually a player plays that game enough to see the other classes in action through NPCs, or they experiment with the new classes themselves. Or if the developers or friends of theirs promote or play something enough to the point where they feel like they can understand it and are comfortable trying it out. It might not be in that game exactly, but it could lay the groundwork for a future one. Eventually their known list of classes grows and grows to where they look at this image and know all of the classes. But sometimes, the natural growth of understanding those classes just doesn't happen. We as game designers aren't perfect. We won't always be able to convey the message to everyone. And if that person does not end up picking up, say, another Pillars of Eternity game, for instance, they might never get to experience what a decipher is. And it's a difficult problem, because we can't remove that pre-existing knowledge. In fact, as designers, we extremely value and heavily consider the knowledge our players might be starting the game with. Games are usually for everybody. We want, and in fact, oftentimes it's our job as game designers for everybody to be able to pick up our game and have a real shot at navigating it. If we know we can put something in our game and almost everyone can understand or identify it without reading or investing time in written introductions and tutorials, that's great. But as I've noticed all of these isolated examples over the years slowly come together, the question in the forefront of my mind when it comes to character classes has become, how as designers do we combat the influence understood classes like Mage, Thief, and Warrior have over a player? How do we give the unknown or even new class packages we include in our game the fighting chance we think they deserve against the ones that players will instantly identify? And I think the answer here comes down to how we package them. There will always be strength in familiarity, but there's also strength in the new and unexplored. It's exciting to try new things. We have to show players that there is something new and exciting in our class selection screens. In our user interface, in our audio, there's so much room to explore there. And that is where I plan to focus my energy moving forward. Not a lot of answers in this video like my other ones, as this is something I'm still pursuing, a design problem I'm still growing to understand the full extent of and take action towards. But I would love to hear what you think. The way we solve problems like this is how we solve problems on any design team. Discussion and experience. Creative individuals coming together to understand the issue and look for solutions. And that's what this channel is made for, to encourage that kind of discussion. So leave a comment below, write an essay even. I will respond to each and every comment. A huge shout out to my patrons over on Patreon, the people who make these kinds of videos possible so frequently. You are all amazing and I appreciate you all. Until next time, my friends, keep designing, never lose your passion, and I will see you all in the next Game Design Talk. Bye guys.